Algorithm. In the last lecture, what we were discussing, the complexity of two type, time complexity and space complexity. Now we discuss time complexity in little detail. What is time complexity? Time complexity, or we can say the time of an algo, which is taken by an algo, it can be a compile time or runtime. The time taken by the algo is compile time plus runtime. Compile time plus runtime. Compile time depend upon the software of the computer, or we can say the programming language of the compiler. Programming language of the compiler. And the runtime depend upon the hardware, or we can say the type of processor used in the system or used in the computer. So our time complexity depend upon these two things: how much time it will take and how much time it will take to run. So because it also depend upon the compiler, so the question comes in our mind that the compiler, if it is C compiler, suppose if it is C compiler, the compiler of C language, or we can say, so is it written in its own language? C compiler written in its own language? No. It always, if this is C compiler, so it always written in another language. It always written in another language initially. Or we can say C compiler written in HTML. So there is no need to compile. There is no need to compile it. So every language compiler will not written in its own language. What does it mean? It means that every language compiler will not written in its own language. It always written in another language, or we can say in another language. Initially, that happens initially, but after some time, it write its own compiler every language write its own compiler in its own language. In its own language. But how it happens? That initially it is not written in its language, but after some time it writes its own compiler in its own language. How? Through bootstrapping. This is the method, or we can say this is the technique by which every language creates its own compiler after a after few time. So what is this bootstrapping? Bootstrapping, we can say it usually refers or called to a self-starting process. Self-starting process that is supposed to continue or grow without external input. This happens through bootstrapping technique or method, we can say. And what is this? It usually refers to a self-starting process. It calls self-starting process that's supposed to continue or grow without any external input. So through this way, every language creates its own compiler after some time. Now we understand which is faster. Which compiler is faster? Which is faster? Compiler made in Java or compiler made in C++ or compiler made in C language. Which compiler is faster? Made in Java, made in C++, or made in C? By time, if we talk about, obviously we are right now talking about the time complexity, so we discuss in the case of time, C compiler is faster. C compiler is faster. But the drawback, or we can say few features are not available in C compiler. What they are? C compiler don't have object oriented programming features. C compiler don't have object oriented programming features and don't have built-in libraries and also don't have built-in libraries. So these two features C compiler doesn't have, but by time it is faster. So because of these two features, we usually use the made in Java compiler, because Java compiler have these features. But if we use C compiler, then how many steps we need? 6 steps. But if we use Java compiler, then how many steps? We need 4 steps. So these are the few important things which we should need to know to go further in that manner. That's why I discussed what is basically time complexity. Time complexity basically based on two things: what software we are using and what kind of hardware we are using. It based on both the things, because compile time is based on the software and the runtime is based on the hardware. So these two things belongs to the time complexity of an algorithm. And how compiler works and in which language it is written. It is initially written in any other language, because we cannot create a compiler in its own language at initial levels. After some time it starts creating its compiler through bootstrapping method. And as we see that C compiler is faster, but it doesn't have oops feature and built-in libraries, so we have to use the Java compiler, which is having all these features. But by step if we are going, then C compiler gives work in 6 steps while Java compiler works in 4 steps.